Our third speaker is Professor Mark Lipovetsky, Professor of Russian Studies at the University of Colorado in Boulder, and the topic of his presentation is the Ardis vision of contemporary Russian literature 30 years later. Professor Lipovetsky.
I also would like to begin with thanking the organizers for inviting me to this symposium. For a person who studied contemporary and now not so contemporary literature for about 30 years, it's the greatest honor I could dream of to be invited to Professor's Symposium. And a little technical preface, Professor Reynolds and me have announced topics which are pretty similar. And in order to avoid significant overlap in our presentations, we decided that he will focus mostly on poetic publications of Ardis, while I will talk mainly about prosaic works. Today, reading the Ardis catalog is only a tad less exciting enterprise than reading books with a horse-ridden carriage on its title page 30 plus years ago. In this paper, and this catalog, by the way, is included into the symposium brochure very helpfully. In this paper, I will take a look at Ardis' selections of Russian fiction over the 70s, 80s from the perspective of today's knowledge about further trajectories taken by Russian literature, especially after 1991, when Soviet barriers protecting the readership from politically and aesthetically suspicious literature failed. Such an approach might be destructive for any press, including the most famed and profitable. After all, there are always publications whose appearance is dictated by the spur of the moment, personal context, or political relevance. However, I believe that Ardis withstands this challenge, and its selection of writers can say a lot about the power lines that have defined the late Soviet émigré, as well as post-Soviet literary fields. The enormous resonance that Ardis publications had in the Soviet Union and abroad, as well as its influence on the post-Soviet cultural process, suggests that the professor's taste not only resonated with certain discourses already existing in Soviet culture, but also reshaped them in a recognizable, yet still elusive discursive formation. And here I think I directly resonate with what Denis just said. To begin with, I decided to compile 3 lists of Russian publications of contemporary Russian prose writers, and you might have them as handout, and I apologize for the fine print. 2 of single-authored books in Russian and in English respectively, and a 3rd one of publications in anthologies of contemporary Russian literature edited by Karland and Lendea Profer. I've set 1991 as the time limit and excluded non-fiction from the former 2 lists, and did not include into the last list such volumes as Metropole, Catalog, Portfolio, or Glagol, since their composition was predominantly defined by their respective editors. While looking at these lists, one should keep in mind, of course, the different goals pursued by these publications. As you can see, hopefully, while the list of books in Russian predominantly comprised those authors who were banned in the Soviet Union, books and anthologies in English pursued primarily another goal: introducing the English-speaking world to the best writing by Russian authors, including those published by Soviet presses. However, in summing up this list, we may surmise the Ardis dream team, and that's the last list here, of those contemporary writers whom the press promoted most consistently. For list 4, I've selected only those who in Tatar was published more than once. With a few notable exceptions, this list comprises all those authors who joined the post-Soviet mainstream and are now filling the shelves of today's book supermarkets in Russia, along with Pelevin and Sorokin, Dontsova and Tulitskaya. In other words, Ardis publications have defined in many ways the post-Soviet canon of true literature from the 70s, 80s. This is not surprising indeed, considering the fact that during perestroika, when interest in literature was at a peak, many Soviet journals simply reprinted Ardis books, frequently forgetting to mention the source of these publications. Two names stand out in these lists, defined, and in the last list especially, defining the spectrum of the Ardis-shaped vision of contemporary Russian fiction: Vasily Aksionov and Sasha Sokolov. I believe that for Professor Aksionov became the symbol of Ardis' position vis-à-vis both Soviet literature, hardliners and liberal alike, and émigré literature heavily dominated by Solzhenitsyn and Kontinent. In Ardis, Aksionov appeared as the largest star in the entire constellation of writers of different generations, frequently much more talented than him, but with some similarity in their aesthetic navigation, from Dovlatov, Voinovich, Gladilin, Lishkovsky, and Maramzin to Vakhtin, Popov, and Miloslavsky. What united them? All these writers, including Aksionov, treated politically charged subjects with irreverent humor. All of them employed measured phantasmagoria, fused with playful language, but restrained by sometimes moralistic, sometimes sentimental, sometimes paradoxical, but typically linear plot lines. Admittedly, these characteristics only partially match Dovlatov or Maramzin with their acute sense of the everyday absurdity. Yet even Dovlatov and Maramzin shared with other writers of this trend such fundamental features as a strong belief in the presence of some solid norms, distorted and concealed by Soviet society, yet serving as a source of irony and sarcasm about abnormal reality. These norms could be interpreted variously, as just common sense in Dovlatov and Gladilin, simple folks' instincts in Voinovich, corporeality in Lishkovsky, or Western lifestyle in Aksionov. The stability of an unspoken, if vague, norm placed many of them, especially Aksionov, Dovlatov, and Voinovich, at the core of the post-Soviet mainstream, resonating with post-Soviet intelligentsia's profound longing for the sense of stability amid social and cultural turmoil, and by this, unwittingly, preparing the acceptance of Putin's stabilization. However, it is this very presence of the invisible norm that decisively separated this prose from modernist aesthetics, with its tireless problematization of all possible norms. Considering the fact that one of the major goals of Ardis was restoring the heritage of Russian modernism, one should not be surprised by Karl Proffer's stern assessments, in which he did not separate some of the Ardis authors from better Soviet writers. For instance, he wrote, quote, "In contrast to Sokolov, writers over 40, whether they live in the USSR or abroad, and whether they publish in Novy Mir or in Kontinent, tend to be realist conservatives in form. It is impossible to tell the dissidents from the socialist realists. Trifonov, Iskander, Voinovich, Nekrasov, Solzhenitsyn, they are all men of the old school in the grand tradition of Tolstoyan prose, or less grandly as it has passed through several decades and numerous Fadeyevs. At Trifonov's apartment, a photograph of Ernest Hemingway hangs on the wall. Voinovich uses a rather old-fashioned narrator in Chonkin, and formally, large parts of Solzhenitsyn novels can be said to be pure socialist realism," end quote. Proffer, as publisher and the critic of contemporary Russian literature, did not always agree with each other. As a critic, Proffer wished to see in Russian literature more daring departures from the stale realist canon. But as a publisher, he had to deal with what was available at the moment. This internal tension explains the meaning of Sasha Sokolov for Ardis. Sokolov exampled the radical alternative to Aksionov's school of middle-of-the-road quasi-modernism. Despite the fact that the sheer number of Sokolov's publications by Ardis is significantly smaller than those by Aksionov, this is quite natural considering the sheer number of Sokolov's books, all of which were published by Ardis, and The School for Fools was translated into Russian by Karl Proffer, a formidable task for any translator. Obviously, Sokolov was the main and the most profound discovery by Ardis in the field of contemporary Russian writings. As early as 1976, in the article In the Shadow of the Monolith, Proffer wrote about Sokolov, I think one event will leave a mark on the literature of this decade. This is the debut of Sasha Sokolov, a 30-year-old Muscovite, end quote. Sokolov's prose is what connected contemporary Russian literature with Nabokov, the greatest star in Ardis universe, and Nabokov's famous blurb to A School for Fools served as a tangible confirmation of this connection. In fact, the characteristics of Sokolov's prose, as highlighted by Profer, seem to be applicable to Nabokov's oeuvre as well. Quote, the complexities of Sokolov's prose are amply rewarded by the fantastic lyricism, charm, and humor of every scene. Behind the most fanciful of digressions, there is always a sense that the author is firmly in control, and the second reading makes one more aware of the careful plans and balanced architecture. On the political level, one has to look much harder for an axe to grind, because except in the very broadest sense, Sokolov is indifferent to literature of social comment, end quote. In the Ardis list of contemporary prose, only Bitov's Pushkinsky Dom, published both in Russian and in English, belongs to the Nabokov/Sokolov line. However, while looking at today's literary landscape, one may confidently detect the lineage established by Ardis' institutionalization, never can pronounce that, I'm sorry, of Sokolov as the heir to Nabokov. Significantly, this lineage is detectable both in the stylistics of some mainstream writers, Tatiana Tolstoy and Olga Slavnikova, and on a much deeper level in the neo-avant-garde or modernist prose or neo-modernist prose of Alexander Goldstein, Denis Osokin, Nikolai Kononov, Valery Votrin, Lena Eltang, Igor Vishnevetsky, Alexander Ilinin, Evgeny Vodolaskin, among quite a few others. Also, Mikhail Shishkin, who along with Sorokin managed to infuse neo-modernist complexity directly into the mainstream literature, continues the trajectory launched in A School for Fools. No wonder that Sokolov speaks so highly of him. Today, Sokolov is less marginalized by dominant cultural conservatism than he was marginalized by Soviet and emigre aesthetic censorship. Yet he remains marginalized nevertheless. Possible frustrations aside, this fact can be interpreted as testimony to the efficacy of the model of contemporary Russian literature created by Ardis. It contained two diverging trajectories, one leading to post-Soviet mainstream and even pop literature, and another appears to be rich enough to feed experimental and neo-modernist literature 30 years later. In fact, one layer in this model cannot exist without another, and Profer's design turned out to be not only steadfast, but also programmatic. At the same time, it is quite possible that Profer himself would not entirely agree with the perception of Sokolov and his followers as cultural innovators. In one of his last articles, he wrote, quote, I purposefully do not say experimentalists, because the most obvious figures who are commonly pigeonholed here, Sasha Sokolov, Andrei Sinyavsky, are for all their innovation traditionalists in the best sense of the word. Like other experimental traditionalists, Sinyavsky and Sokolov have the advantage of almost total ignorance of the ideas educated people associate with Joyce and others in the period around World War I. Otherwise, much of their fiction would be irrelevant, end quote. I suggest that one should read this statement as a sign of Profer's realization of the gap separating contemporary Russian literature of the 70s, 80s from contemporary Western modernism and possibly postmodernism. However, the ultimate, if utopian goal of Ardis as the promoter of contemporary Russian writers was exactly the closing of this gap. This striving, by the way, explains why Ardis's reading list included, among all things Slavic, Douglas Fowler's A Reader's Guide to Gravity Rainbow. Looking at the general plan of Ardis's publications, one can also detect in it a strong overarching desire to establish the lines of continuity, connecting the golden age of Russian literature with modernism through Soviet literature to the underground of the 60s and 80s. Schematically, the strongholds of these lines of continuity look as following: from Pushkin, Gogol, Dostoevsky to Belый, Nabokov, Tsvetaeva, Pasternak, Akhmatova, and Mandelstam, to Bulgakov, Platonov, Babel, Zощenko, to Brodsky, Sokolov, and Aksionov. The line stemming from Tolstoy and going through socialist and social realism to Trifonov and Iskander was represented as well, but significantly less spectacularly than the first one. The diversity and richness of literature scholarship and translations published by Ardis presented a radically new vision of Russian literature's canon. This was Russian literature that remained undamaged or minimally damaged by the Soviet era and its aesthetic preferences. Indeed, this was a new canon of Russian literature, and within it the central place, and rightfully so, belonged to Russian modernism as a true golden age of Russian culture. Modernism not limited by the Silver Age, but stretching across the century from Andrei Bely to Sasha Sokolov. The panorama of Russian modernism presented by Ardis was not only amazingly detailed and nuanced, but also free of many taboos shared by Russo-Soviet liberal intelligentsia. Note, for instance, publications of Kuzmin's «Крылья» and «Занавешенные картинки», Zamyatin's «Нечестивые рассказы» and Limonov's «Русская». Ardis's practical concept of the modernism-centered cultural canon of Russian literature completely justifies the press' laudably consistent resistance to traditional realism, with its humorless ideological tint, realism loaded with curse questions and soapbox rhetoric, to use Proffer's expressions. It also explains the absence in the Ardis catalog of Vasily Grossman's «Жизнь судьба», Friedrich Greenstein's novels, only one novella was published as a part of Metropole, or Georgy Vladimirov's prose. Sinyavsky prose aesthetically did gravitate to the circle of Ardis's authors, to Sokolov's wing, of course, but he had his own press, as we all remember. Proffer frequently ironically spoke of the dominant Russian view that a good book cannot be written by a bad person, and mocked opinions about literature, quote, at least partly based on the civic position of the writer. He methodically rejected, in quotation marks, the Russian idea of a writer's biography as the life of a saint, and defended Nabokov's Lolita from the moralistic attacks, including attacks coming from Nadezhda Yakovlevna Mandelstam, by emphasizing that the writer in his life is different from his protagonist and even his narrator as a product of his imagination. In other words, emphasizing the distinction between a literary text, its author's cultural myth, and a persona behind that myth. At the same time, Proffer nevertheless was very attentive to the correlation among the components of this triad. I believe that the dialectics of неразрывность и неслиянность, indivisibility and insolubility of the literary text, cultural myth, and the author's persona was foundational for his understanding of Russian modernism. Quite telling in this respect is Proffer's characterization of Solzhenitsyn. Quote, one could deduce that Solzhenitsyn feels great kinship with Lenin. The portrait of Lenin from Lenin in Zurich is being called a self-portrait of the author, end quote. Lenin is certainly an anti-hero in Solzhenitsyn's cultural mythology, while the hero is typically represented by the writer's alter ego. Therefore, the similarity between Lenin's and Solzhenitsyn's persona thus appears as a powerful deconstruction of the foundational position of Solzhenitsyn's cultural mythology. This is why it is not too hard to detect the traces of these Russian tendencies in Proffer's own critical prose and memoirs. For instance, when writing about Kataev's late openly modernist books, he could not restrain his disgust, quote, departures from normal chronology must be comprehensible without much page turning, and even then it is allowed mainly to writers over 70 who have proved their loyalty, old men like Kataev who have voted to throw Pasternak out of the Union of Writers in 1958, and dutifully attacked Solzhenitsyn a decade or so late, end quote. He didn't mention, though, that Kataev had introduced to Soviet readers an entire generation of writers through journal Yunist, including such Ardis frontmen as Aksionov and Gladilin, and created such radically modernist texts of the 60s, 80s as Святой колодец or уже написан Вертер, These novels were never published by Ardis, although Kataev's early novella Rastratchiki was translated and published by the press. The fusion of ethics and aesthetics was probably the defining feature of the discourse shared by the circles of the Moscow and Leningrad modernist-oriented, non-conformist Soviet intelligentsia of several generations. The circle of Nadezhda Yakovlevna Mandelstam, to which the prophets were particularly close, was exceptionally ardent in this respect. It is exactly this sensibility that Profer transformed into the implicit foundation of the Ardis canon of Russian literature. Perhaps this hypothetical observation might shed light on some lacuna in the press's panorama of contemporary Russian literature. Tolerable to such patented Soviet social realists as Yuri Trifonov or Fyodor Abramov, Ardis appeared to be much less interested in such officially permitted modernists as Voznesensky, Vysotsky, the Strugatsky brothers, and, well, Kataev. Speaking of the nonconformist literature, one might notice that the Ardis vision of contemporary literature, despite Profer's quest for more radical innovations, did not comprise those literary strategies that, as we know now, brewed Russian postmodernism. These strategies stem from two opposite ends of the cultural spectrum. On the one hand, from the deconstruction of official Soviet literature, which also led to the problematization of the intelligentsia's cultural canon. This is the strategy that has become most pronounced in the works of conceptualists, but not only theirs. On the other hand, these innovative strategies developed from immersion in spheres excluded from cultural sight, socialist, realist, and modernist alike, from the hyper-naturalistic depiction of the dregs of life, from horrors of the everyday, interpreted as the eternal myth-like human condition, from deviant and inappropriate sexuality. In the 70s, 80s, the first tendency was already well represented in poetry by Vsevolod Nekrasov, Genrikh Sabgir, and Igor Kholin, as well as, of course, Dmitry Prigov, published only in Catalog, and Lev Rubinstein. Speaking of prose, one may point at Kholin's short texts, Vladimir Sorokin's work, he was only beginning his writing career in the 80s, and such an underappreciated heir of Rozanov as Pavel Ulitin. The second tendency was epitomized by the prose of Evgeny Kharitonov, Lyudmila Petrushevskaya, and to a certain extent Yuri Mamleev. The latter was mentioned by Karl Profer in one of his critical articles. These tendencies were, in fact, mutually complementary. Probably the most brilliant example of the fusion of the conceptualist critique of cultural canons, official and intelligentsias alike, and the Menipian exploration of the social lower bottom can be found in Venedikt Erofeev's famous Moskva Petushki, which has appeared in Russian only in a small-run Israeli journal in 1973, 300 copies only. Curiously enough, niches, as if prepared for some of these writers, were already present in the Ardis catalog. For instance, Inna Varlamova's, as well as Nina Katerlis and Irina Grekova's prose could be, with a certain effort, read as a very diluted version of Petrushevskaya. Suslov's Plakun Gorod appears as an homage to Mamleev, Oleshkovsky as a predecessor of Venedikt Erofeev, and Popov as his weak imitator, although they were not, but that's how we may read these texts now. However, it is this very sense of normativity, or rather striving for an unshakable norm, if not stylistic, then cultural and or existential, that separates Varlamova, Suslov, Oleshkovsky, and Popov from Petrushevskaya, Mamleev, Erofeev, Kholin, and Kharitonov. I have no information about the reasons explaining why any of the latter writers did not enter the Ardis arc of contemporary literature. However, from the standpoint of the discourse formation discussed above, their aesthetic position could be perceived as ethically questionable, either due to the close relations with socialist realist mythology, as in the case of conceptualists, or due to the excessive attention to Chernucha, although this concept was not yet used in Profer's lifetime. In any case, these transgressions did not fit the Ardis panorama of Russian literature precisely because they undermined the modernist canon in a specific, ethically centered interpretation. They explored despicable socialist realism and equally disgusting Soviet byt as the sources for cultural mythologies, thereby assassinating the very concept of cultural myth and making it relativistic and even funny. Furthermore, such writers as Venedikt Erofeev, Evgeny Kharitonov, Pavel Ulitin or Prigov, much like Rozanov and Harms before them, manifestly collapsed the structural distinction between the text, the cultural myth, and the author's persona, foundational for the interpretation of modernism discussed above, which made their text critically oriented against the modernist heritage. These exclusions, however, only emphasize the significance of the Ardis canon of Russian literature. It already has become an integral part of Russian modernist culture, as the logic shaping this canon stemmed from the text Ardis published. The professor Ardis has effectively crowned the century-long development of Russian modernism by the creation of a bridge connecting figuratively and literally Nadezhda Mandelstam and Sasha Sokolov with Nabokov on the one hand, and 20th century writers with Pushkin, Gogol, and Dostoevsky on the other. There is no better monument to Russian modernism than this one, and hardly could be. Thank you very much.
It is now my great pleasure to introduce our fourth and last speaker, who will be followed by two discussants. That last speaker is Andrew Reynolds, Associate Professor of Slavic Languages and Literatures at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And the topic of his talk today is Missions, Omissions, Missives to the Future, the Ardis Atlas of Contemporary Russian Literature. Professor Reynolds, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Michael, and thanks to the organisers. It's a great honour to be here. And the only change in the title, as Mark suggested, is rather than contemporary Russian literature, contemporary Russian poetry. And as we're talking about canon formation here, that's, I think, at the centre of what we're doing, I wanted to start with an epigraph from W.H. Auden, because we're dealing with who's in and who's out, who's hot and who's not. So Auden says, "No poet or novelist wishes he were the only one who ever lived, but most of them wish they were the only one alive. And quite a number fondly believe their wish has been granted." So that's worth bearing in mind. Okay. So how and to what extent did the Ardis Russian language editions and translations help form the contemporary Russian poetry canon now? By that I mean primarily works written since 1960. I shall ask in the spirit of devil's advocate of what happens when, in the absence of a normal literary process in which, to paraphrase Wordsworth, great writers would be free to create the taste by which they would be relished, one is possibly over-reliant in constructing one's preliminary counter-canon on the judgment of a small circle, even if the circle consists of the most authoritative readers of Russian literature, whether these be other Russian authors, themselves, or outstanding Russian and Western literary critics. Could one argue, though it would almost certainly be churlish to do so, that certain authors or trends were unjustly neglected in the Ardis list, inevitable though such omissions might be? Are there surprisingly few contemporary Russian poets in the Ardis list? Why were there no Ardis book translations of contemporary lyric poets into English? And although my original intention had not been to talk about Brodsky, he insisted on coming into the talk, and I think that's probably quite appropriate. And in fact, maybe the best way to illuminate some of the issues about Russian poetry in general and the Ardis project in particular. Could it be that with the exception of Brodsky, the Ardis map of contemporary poetry was in fact less densely populated than it could have been? And did Brodsky somehow eclipse other poets, both for a Western audience and a Russian audience? Some other questions I might touch upon, or would like to have touched upon, but I will list now for your consideration, how does canon formation operate? Does it differ from country to country, period to period, genre to genre? Is poetry different from prose, for example? Does international canonization differ from national? If so, in what ways? What role does translation and retranslation play? What makes a Russian poem or poet canonical? And so on and so forth. As Mark mentioned in his talk, the Prof's tastes not only resonated with certain discourses already existing in Soviet culture, but also reshaped them into a recognizable yet still elusive discursive formation. So if those discourses already existed, and if only some of them came to the fore in the Ardis publications, why was this? And perhaps the deeper, more interesting questions, which I can not even hope to start talking about today, how did these discourses survive, and to some extent at least in the long run even flourish? Are we dealing with the fact that literary evolution involves changes richer and stranger than those thought of in canon formation philosophy, and how do we set about studying them? So to talk about the canon in general, after various deconstructions of the canons from multicultural and post-colonial perspectives, the possibility of having a single canon is very much an open question, although Russians still seem very wedded to it. Cynthia Havens noted that Glasnost changed Ardis, but some claimed Ardis had a role in triggering Glasnost by forcing the hand of the Soviet literary powers, who were put in the humiliation position of watching a couple of eager Yanks shape and preserve its literary heritage. The words there, shape and preserve, are noteworthy, as they reflect two different elements of canon formation, evaluation and preservation. My sense would be that one of the great achievements of Ardis was to pay equal attention to both aspects, preservation and evaluation. As you know, the canon debate centers on the struggle between the institutional or sociological explanations that the canon is formed by the educational curriculum above all, but by other forces controlled by the state or in those of positions of economic and political power, best expressed by John Guillory's 1993 book, Cultural Capital, and the aesthetic or ethical explanation, which builds on Arnold's claim that true culture is the best that has been thought and said, and that is because, in fact, of the ethics and aesthetics that a work persists. And of course, there are variations of this, T.S. Eliot, Harold Bloom, and so on. It seems to me that neither of these models is particularly helpful in explaining the development of the Ardis counter-canon during the Soviet period. On the one hand, despite what the Guillory version might lead us to expect, it is clear that the official canon did not do a good job of destroying the unofficial canon. So the sociological model does seem to be deeply flawed. It might have done a good job in the short and medium term, but not in the long term, and that's what matters in literature. On the other hand, it's hard to imagine that the aesthetic model of canon formation is completely satisfactory either, because we would normally want to assume that a far bigger cross-section of writers and readers is engaged in that process of deciding what will pass the test of time. To go back to Shelley, of course, it's actually time that decides what is canonical in world literature. But overall, it seems to me that the aesthetic version of the canon seems to be better at explaining how works survive. That perhaps goes contrary maybe to what Mark was arguing, or perhaps rather that we can combine these two models in showing that great works can create their own powerful institutions, whether those be small circles of devoted readers, new means of literary production, samizdat, tamizdat, rival sources of authority, the charismatic power of acts of self-fashioning when they lead to the Russian fusion of life and art, indomitable widows, underground and kitchen culture, circles, alliances, contact with Western scholars, writers, journalists, translators, and so on. And that seems to be the view, the focus on the ethical aesthetic, though, that Karl Proffer believed in. Essentially, he believed in a variation of a Marxist principle, Groucho, not Karl. I mean, anything that could be an acceptable member of Soviet literature couldn't, by definition, be proper literature, I think. At the same time, we should have some caveats. There are reasonable claims to be made about the ways in which even a pure, aesthetically determined canon can exclude some voices without good reason, especially women's voices. There are canon-forming processes going on of all sorts at all time, and sometimes aesthetic judgments can be very hard to call. So again, it's certainly not unproblematic. I think one of the main ways in which Ardis influenced contemporary Russian poetry was, in fact, by its publications of the Silver Age writers. That what was the fact that it wasn't so much important for the poets to be published, but they needed a readership who knew what they were reacting against. That was a necessary condition, the good qualified readership. In other words, for the contemporary poets to be fully appreciated, their potential readers had to be introduced to the writers who had formed them. This is very much Eliot's view of the tradition. Everything changes once a new poet emerges, and then the old poets change as well. It's only when that cultural continuum is reestablished that it's possible to appreciate what is new and what is valuable. I think the most controversial question I want to raise today is, was literature after 1956 an age of poetry or prose? In his essay In the Shadow of the Monolith, Karl Proffer has no doubts. Quote, nearly everyone agrees that the 70s are a time of prose, not poetry. The stars of the 50s, the late 50s, and early 60s are not much in evidence. One might wonder whether there isn't something slightly wrong here, not only in the first statement, but also in the second. It's very possible that the most interesting and important poets of the 1950s and 60s were not the ones who were the explicit stars anyway. And while personal preferences and bias are bound to play a role here, I do think that Jerry Smith is justified in making the following comment in his article, Russian Poetry Since 1945, quote, in the period since 1956, poetry revived alongside prose, and it is not at all clear which of the two has been the most important. So that's another view in it. Actually, have we underestimated the poetry of this period? Is it in fact a very rich resource indeed? The contemporary poets who had books of poetry published by Ardis are, and I'll list them, Gorbanevskaya, Kinzheev, Kublanovsky, Limonov, Lipkin, Lesnianska, Okudjava, Schwartz, Sosnova, Tsvetkov, Ufliand, Galich, and Brodsky. That's a wonderful list with marvelous poets, of course, but one can't help think that given what we actually had in that period, the riches of the period, isn't it a rather restricted group? Aren't there too few poets there? What might be some of the reasons why other poets were not published? And as I said before, why weren't there any collections of contemporary Russian poetry in English translation published by Ardis other than in anthologies and Russian literature tri-quarterly? Were Brodsky's coevals neglected? Those who helped form Brodsky? Certain groups, conceptualists, meta-realists, for example. Mark mentioned to me, and it's confirmed my sense of the situation, that of all of the poets published by Ardis, all of them, with the possible exception of Brodsky himself and maybe Uflian and Schwartz, belong to the post-Acmeist line in Russian poetry. So maybe certain aspects of the broad church of modernist poetics and how they have influenced later poets have been omitted. There were certainly some poets from the current crop that Ardis did omit, not only the conceptualists and the metaphorists, but Krivulin, many writers of the Lianosova group, Gubanov, Aronzon, Sedakova, Yeryomin, Krasovitsky, Kushner, Zhdanov, and many, many more. I'm sure you could add your own favorites to that. So there were so many great poets out there, and yet perhaps not that many in the Ardis list. Now, if one were a conspiracy theorist, which I'm not, but some Russian poets and critics might be, one could argue that perhaps if someone like Brodsky had a hand in the construction of this contemporary canon, might he have argued the case for those who were similar to him in some respects, but less strong, less original? Of course, if he had nothing to do with the process, then that whole question is moot. But I just put it out there for further discussion. In that regard, there's an interesting quote in a Krivulin interview with Valentina Polukhina, quote, Brodsky is a very willing, very sympathetic advocate on behalf of those poets who don't, in his view, threaten him. The fact that Brodsky was supportive of a large number of poets could be seen as a very generous act, and I think it was, but it could also in a strange way be seen as a way of somehow delegitimizing the Brodsky imprimatur. Because if you say so many poets are good, then what does it actually mean? I personally suspect actually the reasons why some of these books were not published are more to do with economic ones, that poetry doesn't get published so much and so on and so forth. Occam's razor would be a good principle here, but as I say, I just wanted to raise some of these questions. Let's now turn to Brodsky, and is it possible that Brodsky's genius caused all of us, artists included, to undervalue other poets? We should perhaps pause to think how incredible Brodsky's national and international canonization was. It couldn't have been predicted, and I'm sure Brodsky's success owed much to the personal support given by Karl and Ellen Dare and the University of Michigan in that process. Just as Akhmatov had felt that the early KGB-inspired fate for Brodsky was ideal, so too in its different form, the post-1972 polar opposite was equally, if not more important, in helping Brodsky become Brodsky. What features allow Brodsky to become a canonical figure? Is it the case, as some have argued, that for both the Western audience and the Russian audience, the romantic model of the poet is still the prime requisite for genius or for greatness? It's understandable that non-Russian speakers would focus on the life to the detriment of the lines because they can't fully appreciate the splendor of the language. But why do Russians seem to do it as well, as a number of people have argued? I'm not sure that they do, but it has been claimed. Perhaps Russian readers are in fact seeing something else instead, that life creationist fusion of art and life that Khodasevich saw as being the defining feature of Pushkin's greatness. So they are in fact understanding the poetic lines at the deepest possible level. I think that is actually what happens. It might be helpful in thinking through some of these questions to contrast summaries of Brodsky's career by two outstanding Brodsky scholars, Jerry Smith here and David Bethea. For Bethea, at a time when even in the USSR Mandelstam's statement, poetry is power, might have seemed empty hyperbole, the Soviet states saw enough of a rival authority in Brodsky to feel, and I quote, compelled to place him in the position of mortal peril, and the charismatic contract was fulfilled. He and his verse rose, so to speak, to the occasion. Moreover, even when Brodsky was forced to live and write in a far cooler Western postmodern culture, Bethea asserts that in the, quote, anti-heroic posture that is still somehow heroic, internalized from his beloved Auden, and in the extravagant claims for American poetry, and in the quixotic demands of the American readership, the Russian bard lives on. Yet, as Smith points out, a close study of the poems of Brodsky's last years suggests not a decline in Brodsky's abilities as a poet, but in his faith in what poetry might achieve. Quote, Brodsky, astonishingly when we first encountered him, still professed and proclaimed this unregenerate faith in the word. The fading of this faith is the most important and the most touching, even tragic, development during the last decade of Brodsky's life. Is there a way to reconcile the views of these two critics, or might there indeed be a third way of approaching Brodsky's late poems? Did he lose this faith in the word, and did this cause a decline in his ambition and the quality of his poetry? If this is so, will there be a knock-on effect? Will doubts as to the supreme worth of Russian poetry be projected onto evaluations of other Russian poets' achievements, fairly or unfairly? I'd want to argue that some of Brodsky's best late poems show how profoundly he had internalized both Anglo-American poetry and literary theory and culture. I suspect that he was experiencing a new period of transition, and a more pared down, less overwrought poetry would have resulted, a type of posthumous writing, if you like, informed by the shades of Hardy and Frost. I'd like to think that an increased interest in Brodsky would lead to an increased interest in other Russian poets, but in any case, many of them deserve serious attention in their own right, and not simply because they were his contemporaries. I'm not sure that a decreased interest in Brodsky would help anyone, though an increased interest in other poets would certainly be very welcome, though that may be an unrealistic hope. Still, if in time to come some poets will come to be seen as the author of poems no less intellectually and verbally brilliant than Brodsky's, and I think that will be the case, by necessity none of them, as yet at least, will have enjoyed that exemplary poet's fate that does lead, whether we like it or not, to that extra power, charisma, authority that a Russian poet like Brodsky or Mandelstam possess. So while the brilliant poems and articles and countless interviews helped create Brodsky, it was the combination, I think, of life and art, in his case, helped by his own genius, of course, that truly made him canonical. In conclusion, I'd just like to say that the Ardis publication of Emigre Writers and Brodsky's brilliant career went a long way to undermining the notion, as Jerry Smith put it, that, quote, until Brodsky broke the mold, it was the normal assumption among Russians in Russia that emigration and or exile, sometimes seen as a quintessentially enabling creative act of the 20th century writer, somehow invalidated a Russian author. Ardis played a central role in turning our attention to those writing outside of Russia, irrespective of which wave of emigration they were in, and moving us towards the acceptance that it is just one Russian literature. This is perhaps their greatest legacy. While the Proffers and Brodsky and Nabokov would always focus on the aesthetic as the most important criterion for inclusion in any canon, I actually think all of them had the elements of the moralist, if not the stern moralist, about them. And I think Ardis's contribution, and I actually welcome this more, was even more valuable as a contribution to the ethical health of Russian culture. Of course, as Brodsky would say, they go hand in hand, though I'm personally still not convinced that aesthetics is the mother of ethics. This poetry, I think, fulfills Camus' demand from art. In the face of repression, human responsibility demands that we open the prisons and give voice to the sorrows and joys of all. Brodsky would always want the last word, so then let us give them to him. On these occasions, I don't think he was being hyperbolic. Quote, in terms of Russian literature, Karl Proffer might be compared to Gutenberg. He changed the very climate of Russian literature. Writers whose works had been rejected or banned now felt themselves freer because they knew that for better or for worse, they could send a piece to Ardis. That's some legacy. And more important still, quote, Karl Proffer was the incarnation of all the best things that humanity and being American represent. That's some tribute. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Reynolds, for another intriguing and indeed provocative talk.